I'm Harold Holzer. I'm the director of Roosevelt House. I have the honor of serving as the Jonathan Fanton director of Roosevelt House. And it's a pleasure to welcome all of you for this special celebration of Ira Katznelson, a longtime and steadfast friend of this institution. I know I don't have to give members of this audience, of all people, a history lesson about Roosevelt House. You've been here often for SSRC programming, and many of you could probably introduce the house to me. But I can't resist observing that you held at least 2 committee meetings, I'm told, in the second floor classroom. The one-time family parlor where FDR shocked some of his contemporaries who didn't think presidents or presidents-elect should speak directly to the people by delivering what amounted to his first fireside chat, although it wasn't counted as such, from the fireplace up there. So today, it's obviously hallowed space. It just sets me to wondering if we will ever, as a people, be designating as a landmark the spots from which President Trump does his tweets, which are the analog to fireside chats in some horrible way, I suppose. We can only imagine where he originates the tweets, or maybe it's better that we don't. Anyway, getting that historical tidbit off my chest frees me to focus, as this special occasion encourages us to do, on the contributions of Ira. Your program will pay tribute to him by examining his impact on the many fields of scholarship in which he has for so long excelled. I want to tell you about the contributions that he has made to the history and success of Roosevelt House, as Jonathan can attest to as well. Ira has been a longtime member of our advisory board and the organizer of many valuable programs here. And of course, there is more to the connection. Ira has been a trailblazing Roosevelt historian. Fear itself is one of the enduring works of scholarship on FDR and his era. And in addition to shaping our understanding of FDR for the 21st century, as a board member, his guidance and wisdom have been invaluable, and that he has been the resident Roosevelt historian of our advisory board has been a mark of distinction for us. Most importantly, perhaps, Ira shepherded a partnership between Roosevelt House and SSRC that has made it possible for us to present public programming of vital importance to our mission, through which we make accessible to the public and invite the public to participate in ongoing conversations about the pressing issues of our time. Our partnership, guided by Ira's commitment and vision, has led to some of our most memorable evenings, including the Anxieties of Democracy series that many of you have attended. And Ira was prescient enough to plan those even before anxiety became manifest. It was, in fact, a foundation stone of our own public programming, encouraging and enabling us to build a Roosevelt House schedule by drawing on the strength and luster of the roster that Ira helped us create. In short, he has helped us become an important place for public discussion, discourse, dialogue, and debate. And we sincerely thank him for that, even as we pledge to continue striving to live up to his example. The other thing that Ira has understood and imparted to us is how crucial it is to engage faculty and the widest range of scholars in our activities. It was in following the example of our SSRC partnership, in fact, that we've focused faculty roundtables and workshops linked to public programming, smaller groups of key thinkers talking to one another in order to sharpen their ideas and shape future scholarship, and the opportunities to meet here in this auditorium to share those ideas and make accessible current and visionary thinking on the state of our society. So Ira, we thank you for establishing this key relationship for us, which we have already agreed will continue with SSRC programming next year, including an event featuring Danielle Allen in November, and hopefully beyond. always a key component of our schedule, as it has been from the start of Ira's commitment to our experiment under Jonathan. Ira, I know you're not looking ahead just yet to your return from Cambridge, but we are, especially to your return to Roosevelt House often as an advisor and speaker. We look forward to many more evenings as stimulating as I know this afternoon will be, though you have set a very high bar as a presenter here, as you recently did once more when you spoke about the impact of the New Deal to open the little exhibit of WPA impact on New York City, which I hope some of you saw on the first floor and all of you will see when you visit our reception afterwards. Perhaps some of you were on hand to hear Ira's memorable riff on the WPA that evening. If you haven't, you can always look on live stream and cut to Ira's remarks because they're worth seeing. So all of us are grateful to the privilege of Ira of knowing you and working with you and hoping that the past is prologue in that regard. And now it's an honor to turn the program over to another distinguished guest. I hope I have the right person to punt it to. Ira's predecessor as president of SSRC, Craig Calhoun. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor for me to participate once again in welcoming guests to an SSRC event. In this case, a meeting of the Ira Katznelson fan club. This afternoon's gathering has a manifest and a latent purpose, or function, if I may gesture to another great Columbia social scientist. Ira has been very insistent with me about which purpose or function should be manifest, the intellectual and public one of exploring the nature and challenges of democratic reason. Nonetheless, I think that the latent function of honoring Ira Katznelson should be made explicit. Today's subtitle, in other words, is as important as the title. Ira has been a wonderful SSRC president, and I think I'm uniquely qualified to assert that. He is a longtime friend of the SSRC and a participant in many of its most successful projects, including, importantly, bringing the state back in some 30 years ago. He was an important board member before he was president. As president, he has initiated exciting, intellectual, and publicly significant programs, new lines of research, and theoretical exploration. The Anxieties of Democracy project, which today's discussion extends, is a case in point. In addition to advancing the SSRC's intellectual profile, Ira has advanced its public engagement in a variety of ways, including even enduring connections to prominent journalists. Not least of all, he has helped put the SSRC on a stronger financial footing for the future. Ira will always be recalled as one of the SSRC's greats. And by recalled, I mean that when Alondra retires, they will probably have you back here giving remarks on the occasion. As it happens, Ira's stewardship of the SSRC builds on and continues a remarkable career of great achievements. These include other examples of institutional leadership. At the very beginning of his career, Ira co-founded the journal Politics and Society. He was chair of the University of Chicago's Distinguished Department of Political Science. He was dean of the graduate faculty at the New School, under a very distinguished president who happens to be here with us. He was chair of the Russell Sage Foundation Board of Trustees. He was president of the American Political Science Association. But at least as important is Ira's intellectual leadership. This is exemplified in a variety of different ways, but I'll just note some of the books that bear testimony to it. Black Men, White Cities, City Trenches, Schooling for All, Marxism and the City, Liberalism's Crooked Circle. In fact, just as Dühring is now known mainly for being the target of a famous anti-Dühring, Adam Mitnick may sometimes be known as the man to whom Ira Katznelson wrote a series of letters with profound thoughts about the future of liberal democracy. desolation and enlightenment, when affirmative action was white, preferences and situations, politics of power, and fear itself, to which reference was just made. He's also edited numerous volumes, some of which, like Working Class Formation, with our late friend Ari Zolberg, have been enormously influential, not least on me. Today's lecture is an exciting prospect because for nearly 50 years, and I'm not kidding, nearly 50 years, Ira's work has been pivotal to understanding contemporary democracy and the historical bases and trajectories that shape it. As we turn now to our manifest purpose of better understanding democratic reason, it turns out that the difference from our latent one is not so great. 5 desiderata are crucial. We can call them Katznelson coordinates, as all have been exemplified and advanced by Ira throughout his career. First, take history seriously. Situate the present in relation to both a past in which not everything had to turn out as it did, and a future that is still open, though not infinitely so. Second, remember that democracy is a matter of politics. And indeed, so is political science, occasional appearances to the contrary notwithstanding. Though shaped by technical and systemic specifics, democracy always escapes these, and renewing democracy today must go beyond technical fixes. Third, do not close inquiry into politics off from efforts to understand society more broadly, including institutions, social movements, and culture. Fourth, see the role of ideas, including the ideas of social science, in shaping material reality and opening it to reshaping. Fifth, make theory a means for understanding the choices before us, critically examining the ways these are formulated and articulating potential consequences. Ira's career, his talk today, and the very existence of the Social Science Research Council make another point. We can do work of fundamental and enduring intellectual significance that is at the same time critical to addressing immediate political challenges. And who can doubt that preserving and deepening democratic reason is among these challenges today? Ira.
I don't embarrass easily, but thank you, Harold. Thank you, Craig. And I'll try not to say more about your overly generous remarks. Well, it is a great privilege to be here in your company and colleagues and friends and in their company. And it's humbling to reflect on our responsibilities to knowledge and public life in the home of Eleanor and Franklin, and to reflect on public life and knowledge from the vantage also of the SSRC, an institution that Franklin Roosevelt served as a member of the Council's Committee on the Future of Business Research when he was governor of New York, and from which he recruited key advisors, including the first president of the Social Science Research Council, Charles Merriam. President Roosevelt's connections to the Social Science Research Council built on relationships that already had been forged with President Hoover, who had, before the crash, asked the SSRC to create what was called the President's Research Committee on Social Trends. That committee produced a landmark volume in 1933 that offered deeply researched analytical portraits of economic, social, and political themes. Those included the status in American life of race and ethnicity, women and the family, business and labor, public welfare, and the organization of government. Rigorous knowledge Presidents Hoover and Roosevelt understood, is best produced under democratic conditions through an open, free process. They knew that democracy best thrives when it makes the values and discoveries of social knowledge a feature of political argument, negotiation, and decision. For all their differences, these leaders apprehended the value to democracy of an organization devoted to the well-being of independent, self-governing, probing scholarship across intellectual borders, an organization that works to deepen the craft of inquiry, enhance the capacities of social scientists, advance the quality of public argument, and thus inform choices amongst policy alternatives. That is what the SSRC did then. That is what we do now. Our founders might well have been influenced by an early passage in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Social Contract that announced the need for a particular kind of social knowledge if we are to confront, in his famous phrase, how man is born free, yet everywhere is in chains. Just before that famous aphorism, Rousseau declared, and I quote, "My purpose is to consider if, in political society, there can be any legitimate and sure principle of government, taking men as they are and laws as they might be. In this inquiry," he continued, "I shall try always to bring together what right permits with what interest prescribes, so that justice and utility are in no way divided." At a moment of turbulence and growing uncertainty, alas, it is impossible not to feel pressure to bolster democracy and defend reason by seeking to bring together what right permits and what interest prescribes, so that justice and utility are in no way divided. Faced with chaotic events and threatening signals, we are being called to tasks of democratic reason that belong to the same family of concerns that stirred Herbert Hoover and his turn to the SSRC in 1929, and that animated meetings in the library just upstairs in late 1932 and early 1933, when President-elect Roosevelt gathered his brain trust to craft the New Deal, an effort to apply democratic reason to the conundrums of liberal democracy just weeks after Adolf Hitler had been designated Chancellor of Germany. The term democratic reason can invoke more than one meaning or orientation. A significant recent book called Democratic Reason by the Yale political theorist Helene Landemore explains why, for all their messiness, decisions taken through collective deliberation and majority rule are likely to be better than decisions arrived at only by the few. Democracy, she argues, is a gamble worth taking. I share that view. But my remarks this evening focus less on what she calls the intelligence of democratic decision-making than on the pursuit of knowledge about liberal democracy by scholars who work in the disciplines that founded the SSRC: anthropology, economics, history, political science, psychology, sociology, statistics. So doing, I want to probe both the subject matter designated by the term democratic reason and the means of inquiry that can advance such reason within the ambit of social science at a moment of peril, both for democracy and the pursuit of knowledge. I will ask these questions. First, what is democratic reason about? What are its subjects, its objects of analysis? Which content should be placed front and center when social scientists explore the character, the possibilities, and the vulnerabilities of modern democracies? Second, which features of social science and which strategies of inquiry are best geared to advance democratic reason, especially when conditions for the creation of rigorous knowledge are not auspicious? In March 2008, Margaret Levy, here this evening, conducted a conversation for the annual review of political science with Robert Dahl, whom she rightly then described as the foremost living theorist of democracy. Maybe you could tell us a little bit why it was that you began to develop the kind of theory in democracy that you did, Margaret asked. Professor Dahl replied, I had the sense that ideas about democracy, theories of democracy, which I had learned about, of course, from graduate school on, from Aristotle and Plato onward, that they were inadequate. I don't want to diminish them. I have always retained great respect for classical and medieval and 18th century theory, but meanwhile, a whole new kind of political system emerged, to which the term democracy became attached, and for which democracy remained an ideal, even though classical democracy as an ideal was far removed from reality. The gap between the ideal and the actual political institutions that had developed, particularly from about the 16th, 17th, and 18th century on, was just enormous. And what we didn't have enough of, had very little of, was an adequate description of what the actual institutions of democracy, modern democracy, representative democracy, were. Now, working in different registers, Dahl brilliantly achieved democratic theory, marked by analytical studies of power, constitutional considerations, accounts of institutions and the policy process, and reflections about democracy's critics. Work that simultaneously is ethical and an effort to describe the world as it is. My biggest personal regret in choosing years ago to complete a PhD in history at Cambridge rather than a PhD in political science at Yale, where I once was headed, is that I missed studying with that remarkable scholar and person. Cautiously, then, I note two sites of undue quiet in Professor Dahl's writings. As I think about deep readings of classical texts by political philosophers, including those in the tradition of Leo Strauss, but also about considerations of the ancients that are inflected by contemporary social science, in important writings by Melissa Lane, Josh Ober, Melissa Schwartzberg, Paul Woodruff, I've come to think that Dahl underestimated the continuing relevance of choices about doctrines and institutions made long ago in Athens and Rome. I also wish he had had more to say about what he calls 18th century theory, a long 18th century, spanning John Locke near the close of the 17th to Alexis de Tocqueville in the first third of the 19th. This evening time is short, so I'll concentrate on the second of these moments. Democratic reason requires coming to terms with the liberal tradition's capacious and contested core concepts, each of which is charged with ambiguity. These include commitments to the rule of law, government by consent, individual rights, political representation that emplaces legislatures at the heart of good government. We can already discern this package of ideas and institutions in Locke's second treatise, a work that gathered many strands of medieval as well as ancient thought to fashion something quite new on the basis of popular sovereignty, expressed through the metaphor of a social contract. We also can see this newness in Tocqueville's Democracy in America, where he famously insisted, and I quote, that a new political science is needed for a world itself quite new. Above all, new because of the thrust he called the progress of equality that underpinned democratic citizenship. The democratization of society and politics, Tocqueville believed, had become irresistible. But key aspects of its future, nonetheless, he thought were unclear. Would democracy be embedded within a liberal frame, or would it induce new and more dangerous forms of illiberal despotism? Nearly 2 centuries later, we've learned painfully that these are not mutually exclusive options. The first task of democratic reason, in my view, is to probe with an institutional and conceptual imagination the central aspects of the liberal tradition that are indispensable to decent democracy. None of the principal ideas or institutions that constitute the liberal aspects of democracy, a depersonalized rule of law, popular consent, individual rights, and political representation, as well as often elusive notions of tolerance and pluralism. None of these is simple or fixed. If, from one angle of vision, they compose what Dahl called an underlying consensus, prior to politics, beneath it, enveloping it, restricting it, conditioning it, their meaning and shape persistently have been subjects of dispute, often fierce disagreement. As a boundary condition for democracy, liberalism informs behavior and connotes varieties of political morality in ways that are not constant over time. Together, the predominant features of political liberalism compose what Ludwig Wittgenstein designated as a family of instances, whose constant core is accompanied by historical and situational variation. Dahl persuasively insisted that liberal concepts should become democratic practices. Following his example, democratic reason must always cross the boundaries, dividing political theory from empirical studies, all the while being mindful of historical and geographic variation and the need to answer the most urgent questions posed by the most urgent question posed by the social sciences, the under what conditions question. What conditions are required to make the constellation of law, consent, rights, representation, pluralism, and toleration combine and succeed as foundations for vibrant democratic politics? But politics about what? To answer, I think we need historical sociology in the grand manner, among others, of Karl Marx, Max Weber, Charles Tilly, who identified and debated the causes and features of large structural shifts to politics, economics, and society in historical time. Reading their work reminds us that the liberal and democratic political traditions are based on assumptions, often tacit, about how the world has come to be organized, sometimes seemingly beyond human control. At the center of the political liberalism that Locke helped invent, and at the center of such liberalism since Locke, lies the assumption that the modern sovereign state, the economy, and civil society compose separate spheres, a very different set of understandings and realities than those that had underpinned Europe's medieval political arrangements, and very different from those of the 20th century dictatorships. Fascism, by contrast, fused the state and civil society. Bolshevism, by contrast, refused any division between property and sovereignty. Liberalism fights those conflations. In early modern Europe, later elsewhere, each zone, that is state, economy, civil society, came to possess a distinct ensemble of institutions, each with its own logic of action. Politics, including a nascent democratic politics, came to be marked by recurring arguments and decisions about the rules that should govern the transactions that connect the state to economic markets and that connect the state to civil society. How, to what extent, and with which instruments should capital, labor, and market transactions be regulated? What is the proper scope and content for associational life? How should the preferences of citizens be represented inside the state? That's the content of normal liberal democratic politics. Democratic reason thus connotes the study of different visions of a good society, each of which offers an account of desired connections across the spheres of state, market, and society in a differentiated world. Here is where the balance of state and market is adjudicated. Here is where the kind of authority and surveillance Michel Foucault called governmentality, vies with the mobilization of active citizens. Within liberal democracies, here, in short, is where vibrant politics takes place. But what, we must ask, are the conditions that sustain such vibrancy? In addition to considerations about core concepts and proper rules of transaction between state and economy, state and civil society, there is a third arena that is at least as fundamental, located at the edges of liberal democracy, frequently dangerous edges. There lie questions for which liberal and democratic traditions often have no inherent answers, and thus find themselves vulnerable, and indeed sometimes even authors of exceptionally ugly possibilities. I am thinking in particular about three enormously vexing matters: religion, membership, and security, issues that have stalked and plagued liberal democracy relentlessly from the start. In his late 17th century letter concerning toleration, John Locke wrote the following urgent sentence, and I quote, "It is not the diversity of opinions which cannot be avoided, but the refusal of toleration to those who are of different opinions that has produced all the bustles and wars that have been in the Christian world upon accounts of religion." Writing 2 centuries later, in 1992, the great philosopher John Rawls noted how before liberalism there was no basis for religious toleration, but how with the existence of toleration there arose a problem for political liberalism that has persisted ever since. And I quote, "How is it possible," Rawls asked, "that there may exist over time a stable and just society of free and equal citizens, profoundly divided by religious and moral doctrines? As religion offers a transcendent element not admitting of compromise," he wrote, "liberal democracies must take to heart the absolute depth of their irreconcilable conflict," end quote. Deep internal pluralism based on spiritual beliefs and doctrinal choices overlap an even more basic question: who qualifies to be a citizen? What are the criteria for membership? From Locke on, the liberal tradition only has had one quite consistent answer, as Uday Mehta's writings have emphasized. A liberal citizen must be a rational adult who can deliberate about public matters. But which persons qualify? Not women in most democracies before the 20th century, surely not slaves, and for many whites, not any person of color. Not the Chinese for John Stuart Mill, whom he designated backward. Not the colonized in global systems of imperialism. Combinations of the criterion of rationality with cultural and racial assessments of capacity frequently made liberalism the handmaiden of stark exclusions, sometimes exclusions so extreme as to turn a blind eye to humiliation, violence, even genocide. Last of the triad is national security, a zone of exceptions within Western liberalism. Under conditions of emergency, Locke wrote in the second treatise, the executive must come to possess, and I quote, the power to act according to discretion without the prescription of law, and sometimes even against it. A prerogative power, he wrote, that is never to be questioned, end quote. A similar hair-raising statement can be found in Federalist 23. Alexander Hamilton wrote the following, the circumstances that endanger the safety of nations are infinite, and for this reason, no constitutional shackles can wisely be imposed on the power to which the care of it is committed. No constitutional shackles. Well, no meaningful democratic reason can elide or ignore these issues of belief, exclusion, and exception. Not then, not now. As war raged in 1942, a 32-year-old sociologist, Robert K. Merton, published a powerful short article called Science and Technology in a Democratic Order. He acutely observed, and I quote, that incipient and actual attacks upon the integrity of science have led scientists to recognize their dependence on particular kinds of social structure, end quote. The ethos of science, which extends into social science, he noted, includes methods by which knowledge is certified, a stock of certified knowledge, and cultural values that underpin the quest for knowledge, including organized skepticism and the impersonal standing of truth claims. These features, he underscored, make science a form of democratic reason. 3 years earlier, in 1939, a terrible year for democracy, Wittgenstein lectured on the foundations of mathematics at Cambridge University. Speaking about the freedom to journey from one logical and empirical world to another, he observed, quote, how we imagine possible structures and impossible structures, and we distinguish both from real structures. Mathematics, he noted, offers the conceivable and the imaginable, but not the real. Yet even within mathematics, Wittgenstein argued, the prospects for imagination are inflected by the real. Conditions that advance the ability to discover and invent, he wrote, lie in the surrounding circumstances. If such is the case for an abstruse and abstract craft as mathematics, how much more so for the social sciences? As Wittgenstein was speaking, Britain, together with Iceland, Ireland, Sweden, and Switzerland, were the only European constitutional democracies still standing. The surrounding circumstances at that moment were inauspicious not just for democracies coming face to face with fascism, Nazism, and Stalin's Bolshevism, each of which claimed to be a more authentic democracy than those based on the liberal values of consent and rights and representation and law. 1939 also was an awful moment for free and rational knowledge. What Wittgenstein was calling the real was constraining the conceivable and the desirable. The faculty and students who gathered to hear him included luminous figures who soon found themselves defending free regimes and free inquiry. Those present included Alan Turing, the computer visionary, now quite widely known for his code-breaking machine at Bletchley during World War II, already a fellow at King's College, Cambridge, and Stephen Toulmin, then merely a first-year undergraduate at King's, training in physics, who later, after service in World War II, became a leading philosopher of ethics and science. Their commitment to speculative and intangible academic reason in the circumstances of 1939 was an affirmation of free thought. For it was not Goya's sleep of reason, but the fusion of social utility with political purity that was making democratic reason, open science, and the institutions that sustain creative inquiry seem incapable, sapped of sufficient vitality. Nietzsche's fear that Western secular modernity stood on thinner and weaker foundational legs than religion seemed realized. Even as Hitler and Stalin divided Poland into Western and Eastern occupied zones, the scale of horrors soon to follow was yet unthinkable. Though world affairs and social science understanding were not Wittgenstein's subjects, it is worth reflecting on his caution, and I quote, that we are so used to the criteria for certain facts that we can completely forget what the criteria are. As it turned out, the unremitting pressures of the 1930s and 1940s made it impossible for the supporters of liberal democracy to become complacent in that way. The fierceness of that time's challenges made it imperative to recall and defend democratic criteria for judging and acting. There was no escape from that responsibility. Today, as we confront the implications for our most cherished values at a time of unsettling transformations to states, economies, cultures, social forms, technologies. As we wrestle with terror and insecurity, economic bust and boom, challenges to identities, leaders who label journalists enemies of the people, and more insecure one-party autocracies in China and Russia, illiberal democracies in Turkey, Hungary, and Poland, failed left populist regimes in Venezuela and other places, persistent and deepening inequalities even in liberated South Africa, and growing doubts across the established democracies about the ability of representative constitutional governments to identify and solve the most pressing issues. All this as the character and meaning of facts, rigorous knowledge, and the process of learning itself have come under fierce, often ignorant, assault. To be sure, democracy lacks clear or coherent philosophical adversaries today. Americans are not filling Madison Square Garden for Russia's Putinism, China's hybrid of markets and political repression, or any other authoritarian model, as they did for Hitler's Germany and Stalin's USSR in the 1930s. Yet, like many at that time, we have become unsure about whether democracy has the capacity to do necessary things. Once again, we live with rupture and newness. We find it difficult to calculate the degree of risk faced by liberal democracy because we are uncertain about the character and meaning of our circumstances. Those of us whose first political commitment is to democracy, a liberal, representative, free, constitutional democracy of inclusive citizenship, find ourselves confused, dispirited, anxious. A brilliant essay about France in 1789, 1948, and 1968 by my dear late friend Aristide Zolberg identified times with just the opposite set of characteristics. Instances he called moments of madness marked by joys of liberation and achievement. Then he observed everything seems possible. Nothing appears unconstrained. In our time of despair, however, the good and the just seem elusive. Cruelty trumps decency. What now is urgent is less a celebration than hard work on the field of knowledge to advance democratic reason. What, I should like to ask, does such reason consist of? What are its contours and contents? I should like to approach these questions in the spirit of Stephen Toulmin's late career book, Cosmopolis, The Hidden Agenda of Modernity. Toulmin reminded his readers that liberalism and democracy had developed within the ambit of ideas about scientific exactitude and human rationality associated with such figures as Bacon, Descartes, Leibniz. Standing on Wittgenstein's philosophical shoulders, Toulmin cautioned against overconfident quests for certainty and the application of timeless abstractions. Instead, he underscored the importance of the particular, the local, the concrete, the practical, together with attention to historical particularity. In this spirit, he recalled how the crisis of capitalist collapse, together with the totalitarian challenge, followed by unprecedented killing fields during the 1930s and 1940s, had fashioned a profound historical break. And I quote, "The Second World War," Toulmin wrote, "offered the last time when people could endorse and act out the ideals and ambitions of modernity in a quite unself-conscious manner. Afterward, it was no longer possible to draw a direct causal line from knowledge to policy within a taken-for-granted enlightenment. Even for persons who were not subject to the humiliations of still functioning empires or the exclusions of racial hierarchies. At that moment, as the war was raging, a wide range of scholars mobilized to rescue the Enlightenment tradition by giving it a new realism and much fortification. Colleagues as different as the theorists Hannah Arendt and Karl Polanyi, and students of political behavior and public policy, including David Truman, Robert Dahl, Charles Lindblom, Harold Lasswell, understood, as I once wrote, that a simple reassertion of liberal modernism had become radically insufficient. They insisted on critical adjustments geared to thicken defenses against evil and deepen our capacity to reason. They are my heroes. They turned to analytical history and social science in all its varieties to fashion more capable democratic reason. Affiliating disciplined study with normative purpose, they sought to secure a realistic version of enlightenment and to enlarge its span of sensibility as the best, perhaps only humane option on offer. Their achievements challenge us here and now to reflect on how we might best guard our most precious and most decent political assets. These endowments include the commitment to enlightened secular knowledge that from the late 19th century provided the ambit for modern social science. Democratic reason, the post-war scholars understood, had deep roots in the fictional imaginary of a social contract composed, among others, by Locke and Rousseau that signified popular consent to be governed by legitimate authorities. A striking feature of their social contract treatises was the central importance they attributed to systematic knowledge, social knowledge, that at once is ethical, theoretical, empirical. At its best, modern ethical, theoretical, and empirical social science, the social science the SSRC has been advancing with a global awareness since 1923, has been indispensable for democratic reason. Its social inquiry assesses men and women as they are and aims to discover human institutions that can conjoin justice and utility. That quest underpinned how the leaders of the early 20th century social science disciplines approached the creation of the SSRC nearly a century ago. Their combination of ambitions and orientations gave birth to an institution whose most basic commitments have remained constant across the decades. Before the crises of mid-century, the SSRC's goals and instruments seemed almost as natural as the air we breathe. Most important, they went hand in hand with what, in the immediate aftermath of World War I and Versailles, seemed like halcyon days for Western liberalism and constitutional democracy. Like the generation of my heroes, those of us who are privileged to inhabit the world of scholarship must pursue social inquiry to secure democratic ideals and ambitions when, once again, the conditions that underpin such pursuits no longer can be unself-conscious. I have suggested this evening that we need to focus sharply on a demanding agenda. About what do we need deeper knowledge? In which manner should we defend, justify, revise, and reinforce the political traditions we cherish, commitments to liberal democracy that the SSRC was inaugurated to achieve? Which means are best geared to secure democratic reason for our interesting times? We must deploy, and I'm closing now, the legitimacy, standing, and capacities of the Social Science Research Council to advance our organization's essential obligations to scholarship, to the infrastructure of social research, to standards of inquiry and evidence, and the role rigorous understanding plays in public affairs. To this end, the coming weeks will witness the launch of a new project on the media and democracy, with thanks to the Knight Foundation, the initial planning meeting of a consideration of race in America in tandem with the upcoming 75th anniversaries of Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma and Horace Caton and St. Clair Drake's Black Metropolis, with thanks to the Russell Sage Foundation, and the first gathering of the recently announced SSRC task force to secure knowledge that is charged to address concerns for the integrity of the federal statistical system, the array of institutions that undergird the quest for democratic reason, the mobility of scholars and their ideas across national boundaries, patterns of scholarly self-governance, and the balance between autonomy and accountability. Early in his introduction to Democracy in America, Tocqueville confidently asked, "Does anyone imagine that democracy, which has destroyed the feudal system and vanquished kings, will stop now when it has grown so strong and its adversaries so weak?" Would that we could be as confident. Our responsibilities for democracy are sharper, more demanding than at any time since my childhood. If we are to renew democracy and secure knowledge, institutions like ours must advance democratic reason with clarity, dedication, and purpose. I think we must, I know we can, and I'm confident that we will. Thank you.
That was wonderful, inspiring, challenging, Ira. Thank you. We now have the privilege of 2 commentators and then a larger discussion in which the 4 of us will join. Let me introduce the commentators one by one. The first is Ian Shapiro, Sterling Professor of Political Science at Yale University, where he also directs the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies. Ian has written widely and influentially on democracy, justice, and methods of social inquiry. Since I hold that generating engaging controversy is one of the hallmarks of successful work in social science, I will cite Ian's most recent book, Politics Against Domination, which continues his argument that democracy's value comes primarily from its potential to limit domination, rather than from providing a system of participation, representation, or preference aggregation. Ian, would you come forward to speak? We'll gather later up here.
Good evening, everybody. It's a real privilege to be here. It goes without saying, but it's also a pleasure to be here to partake in this celebration of Ira's contributions to knowledge, and particularly his contributions to the SSRC. And it's, of course, always daunting. Nobody ever wants to speak after Ira. And so I will just have to live with that. Why Ira is so much fun to engage with is because he's a sui generis figure. He's got his inimitable contrarian blend of history, political science, and principled public commentary is relentlessly engaging. And it was all on display in this lecture that he just gave us today. And it's indeed displayed through much of his work. Many of his books were mentioned earlier. My 2 favorites are When Affirmative Action Was White, and of course, Fear Itself, which is surely one of the best books written about the New Deal, surely one of the best books written about Congress, and without doubt, the best book written about both. I think that that's not true. But what I want to do today is zero in on the part of what he had to say that I think is most directly relevant to his legacy at the SSRC and the future of the SSRC, given the times in which we are living. And I see that as really zeroing in on the place of social science in politics and public policy. Seems to me that that's what the SSRC has been about since the beginning, and it certainly has a lot to do with what Ira has had to say and the contribution he's made. And I want to focus on one of the questions he posed in the course of his talk that he circulated in his notes to us beforehand. What characteristics, Ira asked, and what features of social science are best suited to advance democratic reason? I'll just repeat it. What characteristics and what features of social science are best suited to advance democratic reason. And what I want to do in my few minutes here is tease out three models of the relations between social science and democratic politics to move the debate forward and perhaps elicit Ira's reflections on them as we go into discussion. And just for want of more imaginative labels, I'm going to call one progressive, I'm going to call one technocratic, and I'm going to call the third one embedded. And I'll give examples, brief examples of each one. What I'm calling the progressive model of the relationship between democracy and science, particularly social science, is probably exemplified most definitively by Dewey. Hence, one of the reasons I'm calling it the progressive conception. And Dewey held the view that the methods of science and the methods of democracy were more or less the same. And he had this view that the scientific attitude of critical reflection would gradually become diffused throughout the population, so that voters would become sort of miniature scientists and be able to think like scientists while conducting themselves as citizens. So there would be this kind of marrying of democratic political participation and the methods of science as one and the same thing. And I'll give one illustration of how optimistic he was about what this could deliver. In 1929, 6 years after the founding of the SSRC, and in one of his less well-known but quite remarkable books called Individualism, Old and New, Dewey was meditating upon how to deal with crime. And he said that the current way of treating criminality and criminals is reminiscent of the way in which diseases were once thought of and dealt with. Their origins were once thought to be moral and personal. The possibility of effective treatment began when these diseases were regarded as having an intrinsic origin in the interactions of the organisms with its natural environment. We're only just beginning to think of criminality as an equally intrinsic manifestation on interactions between an individual and a social environment. With respect to it, and with respect to many other evils, we persist in thinking and acting in pre-scientific moral, in quotes, terms. This pre-scientific conception of, quote, evil, unquote, is probably the greatest barrier that exists to real reform. So this was the progressive conception that everyone would adopt this non-moralistic scientific problem-solving attitude toward social problems, and it would gradually become diffused throughout the culture as people became miniature scientists. Now, I chose that quote because it bristles with naivety in so many different ways. But I want to focus on a couple of them because I think they're important for us going forward. One is that voters are not scientists and they never will become scientists. They will continue to select on the dependent variable. They will continue to commit massive logical fallacies in their reasoning. And that is in the nature of politics. But secondly, the kinds of solutions he's talking about, the sort of wringing the politics out of politics, if you like, will never happen for at least two reasons. One is it leads to a kind of denial of morality and individual responsibility, which people are never going to actually buy. And secondly, it ignores the distributive conflicts of interest that invariably accompany any public policy decision. Even if you have the best decision, the best policy in a technocratic sense, and I'll come back to this in a few minutes, even if you have what is inarguably the best, even if not treating criminals in moralistic ways would produce less recidivism, and it can be shown definitively. It's not going to be the case that these policies are going to affect everyone equally, and therefore you're going to continue to have political conflict, contestation, and disagreement about what should be done. So that's I think the progressive conception, even though it sort of coincided with the founding of the SSRC, and it was very much embraced this rather naive view of science that would wring the politics out of politics, is clearly something that is not to be on the agenda. Then in some ways, going to the opposite extreme, there's a view of the relationship between science, and particularly social science, and politics that I'm calling technocratic, which suggests that far from becoming miniature scientists, voters increasingly, and perhaps even politicians, should defer to technocratic solutions. We see this all over in politics. The most recent manifestation of it in our current memory, of course, has been the fashion for independent central banking, turning politics, taking things out of politics, turning them over to technocrats and experts. And indeed, the example I want to give of the technocratic relationship between social science and democracy, I think is well selected from the recent financial crisis, where particularly Tim Geithner, and I'm thinking now of his own unapologetic account of what he did in his book Stress Test, published in 2014. He confronted the question very bluntly of why he thought it necessary to bail out all the banks, pay in addition to the multi-billion, hundreds of billions of dollars of bailouts, pay things like the bonuses of $165 million to the executives at AIG, and generally simply work with the people who had caused the problem. And he said this was what we had to do to avoid a complete financial meltdown of the system. So this is a situation, if like he was invoking the notion that everybody should defer to him. The voters should defer to the technocrats, and indeed the politicians. If you read Ron Susskind's book, Confidence Men, which is about the first year of the Obama administration when they were actually writing the Dodd-Frank legislation, it's clear that that his and Summers' capture of the policy-making process in the White House was virtually complete. I'm not even sure why I'm saying virtually, and so this is a second model, and I think it's in some ways just as unrealistic as the progressive model, but it also has more pernicious implications. For one thing, the experts, while they may indeed be right, and I want to concede for the purpose of discussion here that what Geithner did might have been the best way to avoid a complete financial meltdown. Nonetheless, they are fallible and they don't know as much as they think they know. If you want a sort of illustration of this in four-part harmony, just go back and read Ben Bernanke's 2004 lecture on the Great Moderation, which was celebrating the fact that they had finally figured out how to tame the business cycle, and that the advances in monetary theory made it possible to put things safely in the hands of independent bureaucrats and let them have at it. So this is a naive view as well, I think, for two reasons that I want to emphasize, maybe for more. And one is, again, as with when I was speaking about Dewey, one is a moral reason that it obviously, and we've seen this illustrated in many ways, creates the sorts of policies they've enacted created many moral hazards and are creating them again as we are inflating a new bubble. But then also, again, there are, even if Geithner is right, and let's concede that he was, there are huge distributive implications to the fact that they bailed out the bankers and not the homeowners. The fact that if you look at who's recovered and how well they've recovered since the financial crisis, all it's done is accelerate the growing inequality that's been going on for decades. And it has finally produced a massive voter backlash. If you think about Michael Gove in the run-up to Brexit, the Brexit vote last summer, declaring at the top of his voice and to huge applause line, the British people have had enough of experts. Or if you read Stan Greenberg's excellent analysis in the American Prospect yesterday of he calls it the Democrats' working class problem. Again, Greenberg's point, it's not just the white working class that Hillary lost, it's the whole working class. It was much less turnout of African American and Hispanic working class voters than was anticipated. And much of it is laid at the door of, in Greenberg's analysis, of the Obama policy of deferring to Geithner's technocratic analysis, which bred the rage and disaffection for that the Clinton campaign ended up paying the price for. So I think that the great danger of this technocratic model of the place of social science in public policy making is it's likely not only to fail because of the hubris and overconfidence, but also because it ignores moral culpability and responsibility of people who were responsible for the crisis and actually got rewarded, never mind punished. And finally, it ignores the distributive implications. So let me talk about the third and final model. And here, I want to go back to John Stuart Mill. This is what I call the embedded model of the place of science in politics and public policy. Now, Mill was certainly also committed to science and the advancement of knowledge, and he thought it should inform utilitarian public policy making, but he also thought it should have a subordinate place in public policy making. It should be subject to contestation in the marketplace of ideas and subject to political competition. And again, let me give you an example to just fix our intuitions. And this is his defense of free trade in the last chapter of On Liberty, published in 1859. Mill says in there he's discussing policies that should be adopted when somebody is inevitably harmed. And his starting point is whatever trade regime you have, some groups are going to be harmed by that trade regime. He says, it was once held to be the duty of governments, in all cases which were considered of importance, to fix prices and regulate the processes of manufacture. But it is now recognized, though not till after a long struggle, that both the cheapness and the good quality of commodities are most effectually provided for by leaving the producers and sellers perfectly free under the sole check of equal freedom to the buyers for supplying themselves elsewhere. This is the so-called doctrine of free trade. So he says, we have to have a trade regime. Some groups are going to be harmed, so we should do what's best for society. And the science of economics tells us that that's a free trade regime. Now, what's interesting about this, I think, is he thinks there's a right answer from a point of view of social science, and he thinks he knows what it is, and he thinks there's a certain amount of expert consensus about that. But secondly, and this is hugely important, much of the argument of On Liberty is an argument that all knowledge claims are corrigible and fallible. Even the experts are often wrong, and even when they're right, they're almost never going to be completely right. they're going to be at least partly wrong, and therefore the mark of the critical scientific attitude is subjecting your accepted wisdom to the constant barrage of public criticism, defending it in the marketplace of ideas and through the political process. And then thirdly, he is not ducking from or hiding the fact that a free trade regime is going to harm some groups in society. Indeed, he's talking about it. He's saying any trade regime is going to harm some groups in society, and he thinks that that has to be addressed through the political process. And so that's one of the reasons why he wants to, as I using the word, embed social science into the political decision-making process, but keep it in a subordinate role, informing public decision-making, but not supplanting it, and not particularly allowing it to capture that decision-making process. And based on what I've read about the history of the SSRC, and particularly during the time of FDR and in the New Deal, but Ira can comment at much greater length than me about this, it seemed to me that was this what I'm calling this embedded vision, and illustrating with Mill's response, is pretty much how scientists were embedded into the political process during the New Deal. And I think that that's what we have lost, and that's what we need to get back to. How we're going to do it is very tough, but it's perhaps a central question for our generation and the next one. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. We now will hear from Alondra Nelson, Professor of Sociology and Dean of Social Science at Columbia University, but much more importantly for the present occasion, the President-elect of the Social Science Research Council. Alondra has published broadly on the intersections of science, technology, and social inequality, notably in The Social Life of DNA, Race, Reparations, and Reconciliation After the Genome, and Body and Soul, the Black Panther Party and the Fight Against Medical Discrimination. She has contributed to national policy discussions on inequality and about the social implications of new technologies, including artificial intelligence, big data, and human gene editing. One of her core themes concerns ways in which arguments from data and scientific fact are woven into politically interested and culturally informed narratives, not least, but not only, informed by race and racialization. Alondra.
Thank you, Craig. Good afternoon, everyone. It is, I will use Ian's word, daunting, but also thrilling to follow Ira at this podium and also at the SSRC. Ira, thank you for your thought-provoking presentation, which was trademark Ira. It was capacious. It was sweeping in its erudition. It was brilliant, and also thoughtful about the role of the council going forward. So your presentation, I thought, importantly placed the work of the council against a sometimes unarticulated or latent but ever-present backdrop of democratic principles. Certainly you suggested this in your early remarks in the beginning of your presentation, and it's been reinforced for me last month. I spent 2 days at the Rockefeller Archive Center looking at some of the SSRC archives, and there was an implicit principle in these founding documents that the council was well aware that democracy required a kind of tier or valence of experts that were knowledgeable about the social world, and relatedly that proper governance of the said social world required tools of the social sciences, from the analysis of early social data to the framing of clusters of problems that might inhibit or indeed enable human thriving. We might also think of your presentation today as bookends to your ongoing intellectual project, with, on the one hand, or on one end, your many scholarly contributions in the area of democracy and reason, broadly construed, including books that folks have mentioned, Desolation and Enlightenment, Schooling for All, and more recently, Fear Itself. On the other hand, or the other bookend, we might think of this presentation today, as you ended, regarding the probing issues that underscore the To Secure Knowledge Task Force, issues about federal and municipal data, about scholarly mobility, and about the very nature of scholarship in this moment. So your oeuvre, variously, I think, has prepared us for this moment, Ira, of democratic disease. Your books and articles variously illuminate democracy's strange bedfellows and its paradoxes. The former is perhaps best exemplified by Fear Itself, in which you demonstrate how Franklin Delano Roosevelt advanced the cause of democracy by forging strategic yet troubling alliances with Stalin, with Southern segregationists, and with others. On democracy's paradoxes, we need look no further than when affirmative action was white, which exemplifies US democracy's many foundational contradictions. And you note in the preface to this book, titled Du Bois's Paradoxes, the way that race plays a role in this conversation. You quote from Great Barrington's own W.B. Du Bois, the sociologist, writing in 1935 that 3/4 of African Americans, quote, are disenfranchised, yet no writing on democratic reform says a word about Negroes, close quote. This paradox, of course, as you write, is that this was articulated at a time of the New Deal, when the social safety net and workers' protections were beginning to be extended to ever more segments of the US population, but indeed excluded millions. Du Bois lamented democracy's unevenness in a June 1935 issue of Curtain History. This is what you quote from. But of course, the sentiment were channeled, of course, in the ideas of his magisterial book, also published in 1935, Black Reconstruction in America, an essay toward the history of the part which Black folk played in an attempt to reconstruct democracy in America. So in this work, Du Bois is tracing social shifts that transform the types and styles of racial democracy and indeed of racial inequality, tracking its interdependence with political economy and human migration. For Du Bois, the post-emancipation period could have been one of national renewal of democratic ideals that were deformed and degraded by chattel slavery, and 150 years later by what he terms the Black Codes of the South, a caste system of racial terror and disenfranchisement, and what he also calls the abolition democracy of the North that was beholden to the power of capitalism. So pushing on Ira's notion of Du Bois' paradox, what's paradoxical here as well is the failure for democracy, of course, to live up to its core ideals. Du Bois observes what others have noted, the threadbareness of these ideals at times, observations that we would hope could have steeled us in a time of democratic crisis. Du Bois offered for us a gimlet-eyed look at the vulnerability of modern democracies that we might have hoped would steel us when the faith in them becomes shattered, when the principles we long thought were institutionalized come to be exposed as norms that can be thrown off. So W.B. Du Bois, as you know, lived for close to 100 years, and his sort of ebb and flow, his vacillation on the relationship and the possibility of the relationship between democracy and reason, I think, are illuminating for our conversation going forward. So early on in the first decade of the 20th century, he offered for us that democracy was quote, not so much compulsion and control as enlightenment and learning, close quote. He was interested here in his talented 10th mode and the role that professionals played to be the first to perceive democracy as a gateway to individual liberty of speech and of thought, and then as a way to demonstrate this to their fellow citizens. On the other hand, he also argued that American democracy crippled itself by arbitrarily excluding groups of citizens, including women, including people of color. So his commitments here to the relationship between democracy and reason are clear. One requires the other. But again, by 1935, he was much more skeptical. So we're talking not just 2 decades later about the ability of reason and facts to keep democracy afloat. He writes in Black Reconstruction the following, and this is his sort of pessimism about the power of fact. Quote, "It would be only fair to the reader to say frankly in advance that the attitude of any person towards this story will be distinctly influenced by his theories of the Negro race. If he believes that the Negro in America, and in general, is an average or ordinary human being under a given environment and develops like other human beings, then he will read this story and judge it by the facts adduced. If, however, he regards the Negro as a distinctly inferior creation who can never successfully take part in modern civilization and whose emancipation and enfranchisement gestures against nature, then he will need something more than the sort of facts that I have set down," close quote. So Du Bois here offers for us a distinct pessimism about the power of reason to ensure democracy. And I think that he offers for us an example that social scientists must also attend not only to the liberal, as Ira suggested, but also to the illogical. That the work for today's social scientists seeking to secure knowledge is to better understand when and how democratic reason fails. And what, if there are any alternatives to this assumption of a kind of plurality of rational citizens? How do we and can we renew democratic reason? This is the conundrum that faces social science today. Democratic reason both as it should be and as it is. The future work of the SSRC must engage both, and as we embark on this work, we do so with a deep gratitude to Ira for his intellectual leadership that has shown stark and necessary light on democracy's anxieties. Thanks.
Ira, you should be somewhere near the center.
Was that a political statement, or?
As in all great statements, it was meant in every register. Okay, we have time for a brief discussion, which will center in part on Ira's response to the comments from both Ian and Alondra. And I am charged with just being a discussion starter here. So, would you like a first question? Or would you like to respond to the questions you've been posed there first?
You're the boss.
So, yeah, he says I'm the boss, but there's always a backstage to politics. And in this one he said, Craig, here are the 4 things you must do tonight. So I'll go ahead and do the third of those 4 things and ask a first question to get this going. And it isn't about immediately yet what Ian or Alondra said, but one of Ira's comments that I thought was a really important one about the way in which big macro-structural changes in reality constitute the social world that we then have assumptions about in democratic theory. You referred to the division of spheres and the way in which, for example, there are or aren't transactions across economy and politics, politics and society, and so forth. I wanted just to ask whether one of those big structuring assumptions is that we are in a world of nations. When you spoke about security, you spoke about national security as the assumption of the domain of security there. Is this one of those realities that structures are thinking about democracy? And has it become increasingly problematic? Is it something that we have to deal with in a new way? It's a yes or no question.
The combination of these really stunning and challenging comments by Ian and Alondra, layered on top of by your profound question, give me a bit of freedom to ruminate. So let me just say 2 or 3 things, and I will come to your question. Ian asked, he said, I'm curious to know which of these 3 modes Ira might agree with. Mode number 1 is naive. Mode number 2 is dangerous. And mode number 3 is superb. Ira, which would you like? So I think the question, let's assume for a moment that we will agree that we have to be, all of us, in the 3rd mode. And I want to take Alondra's challenge, I mean your personal challenge, but the challenge raised through Du Bois, and even through my own quotation of Du Bois, about the capacities of democracy in the face of, let's call it, both illogic and illiberal sensibilities, and to think about the capacity of the embedded project within the large macroscopic transformations that are underway, and which, among other things, the new institute that Craig is now leading is devoted to understand big change. Let me say the following about the embedded position. It seems to me it requires 3, and some here have heard me say this before, so I apologize in advance, but it requires 3 different kinds of sensibilities, refuse to choose amongst them. One of these sensibilities is what might be called pragmatic. And by pragmatic, I mean both in scientific and in political terms, because the point of the embedded Millian alternative was to say we have to experiment. We have to try things out, and we can't do so with a sense of self-assurance that we know exactly what the right answer is, the expertise version, or expecting citizens to be scientists. So we need a kind of experimental pragmatism. Second, we need what John Rawls called in late work in his Law of Peoples book, realistic utopias. Abolitionism was a realistic utopia. The civil rights movement was a realistic utopia. By that I mean it was beyond, in the 1820s and 1830s, it was beyond the imagination that slavery, which was like a fact of nature, would ever be overcome, at least not in anyone's then lifetime. And yet the abolitionists, black and white, imagined that realistic utopian thought. And utopian, because it was beyond what seemed possible, but realistic, as we actually now know, it could be achieved. And it seems to me that the embedded world can't just be pragmatic, one policy at a time. It has to be enclosed within visions that contain what Rawls called realistic utopias. Third sensibility, and the last, comes from somebody I know deeply admire, the late Judith Shklar, her version of liberalism was aimed primarily not what she called the liberalism of fear, was not a liberalism aimed at attaining justice, but at preventing cruelty, based on the sensibilities that things can always get worse. They don't always get better. Seems to me that the pathway I would label democratic reason, and that you, Ian, were labeling as embedded, requires each of those sensibilities. And it's just that kind of sensibility that brings me both to Alondra and Craig's thoughts, because as I said in passing, and whether clearly enough or not, I'm not sure, the liberal tradition which I cherish. None of us in this room would want to live in a world without individual rights, without rule of law, without government by consent, without political representation. And most of the great struggles, including those Du Bois was involved with, were for inclusion in the domain of those capacities. But the liberal tradition has proved itself capable of, let's call it promiscuity, of sometimes living with authoritarian rules. Think of U.S. policies in Central America over many, many decades, dealing with thugs, or et cetera. And think about the history of exclusions that were legitimated by liberal understandings about the importance of rationality. Those people don't have it. They're out. So the liberal world, which I cherish, which we cherish, can only succeed if it manages to be self-aware of its own vulnerabilities, its own weaknesses, and its own capacity sometimes for the illiberal. So that the scope, the field of liberalism is a field of conflict, of struggle, it has agonistic qualities as well as embedded qualities. And finally, boy, have I gone on too long. It's my want, however.
No, I'm in charge.
Yeah,
You're doing fine.
the big change. I don't know, frankly, how to answer the question about the future of the nation state. You know, we had yesterday a president of one country say, we have to make America great again. Well, that's certainly bounded. We had the president of another country today, France, say, we have to make the planet great again. But there are all kinds of spaces in between those two. I think what's characteristic of our time is that we live with layered forms of identity. Some are much smaller than the nation state. Some are much larger than the nation state. And what we have yet to figure out is how to navigate successfully amongst them, and more particularly for the conversation we're having here, how to navigate amongst them in ways that both secure liberal democratic value and reason, but also open up lots of space for meaningful contestation. One last sentence and then I'll be quiet. Which has to do with the relationship of science and democracy. It seems to me that something Merton wrote about in that essay I quoted is fundamental. Namely, the ethos of science is an ethos of uncertainty. It's an ethos of discovery without ever reaching a firm, fixed, final conclusion. It's a process of renewal. Democracy, when it works, is a system that provides provisional answers, provisional public policies. And we have elections, disagreement about what I was calling the transactions, big words, between state and society, and state and civil society. We fight about that in our normal politics. The British are fighting about it right now in an election to take place in a few days. That's good. It's normal. And it's that instinct for what I would call bounded uncertainty, bounded provisionality, bounded always, one hopes, by some constants, namely rule of law, government by consent, individual rights, and so on. When democracy bursts the bounds of those boundary conditions, there's hell to pay.
Think of your response? Yeah, I think, yeah. So I guess I have just two kind of, or three disjointed responses. One was, you know, as I said to Ian when he sat down, as a sociologist, I love a good typology. You know, anytime you give me like a 3x3 grid, I'm in happy space. But I was struck that, you know, only one of your three kind of models had a moral valence, and it was a negative moral valence. And so, and that was the technocratic, and that there were sort of harms that accrued that didn't, you know, that weren't sort of morally anticipated or morally responded to, and I think in an efficacious way you were suggesting. But I was struck by the lack of any kind of moral valence in the embedded scenario, right, in which you have sort of freewheeling, you know, in the sort of free market trade. So I wanted to sort of push a little bit and talk a bit about, you know, where morals and ethics sort of lie in this conversation. A second comment about the sort of nation state. I mean, you know, one of the things that's interesting in the realm of science around nation states is their inability to deal with planetary issues, right? Be it climate change, right? Or even something like human gene editing, which we are approaching in a nation state form. So China should have this policy, the US should have this policy, when it's the case that if we change the human germline, it affects all of humanity for generations to come. And so, you know, I do think it's an interesting question to quibble with. I mean, obviously nation states are good for getting things done. We need the nation state form for forms of kind of bureaucratic governance and these sorts of things. But, you know, it's worth thinking about, you know, what's the nation state for and when the scale of the state is useful. And then lastly, in response to your last comment, Ira, I also wanted to think about vis-a-vis Merton and vis-a-vis what makes science proceed. I think it's a great model for thinking about how democratic reason or democracy can proceed. But what about the sort of ethos or ethics of failure that's so central to scientific progress? You know, failed experiments, null findings. And so, you know, I was a little bit what I was trying to suggest as I was wrapping up about, you know, what we can learn and do with in the social sciences, the failures of democratic reason, and how we might push on that thinking forward.
Ian, any agenda you want to put on the table at this point, or response?
Well, I could say a number of things, but I'm sensitive to the fact that time is passing, and I know there's a great deal of creative intelligence in this room, so I'll just limit myself to one thing, which is addressing the point you just made and Ira's response to what I said. It seems to me, yeah, I wasn't suggesting these three were on an equal footing, but what I was more trying to do was to invite you to do what you did, which is tease out some of the implications of this embedded model. But it seems to me just, you know, layering on top of what you said, that it seems that what we're really looking for is a scientific sensibility which is also acutely aware of its own limitations, and strip it of its summers like hubris that so often goes with it. But then secondly, that there's an important institutional challenge, which is how do you get political institutions to operate where they can take advantage of scientific expertise, but keep it subordinate to the political process and prevent it from being captured. And I think that's one of the most important things we should be talking about going forward.
Okay. I'm going to take a cue from Ian here and just proceed directly to invite the audience to join in the discussion. Since we are running a bit late, we have to take some time out of something. Let's take it out of us. Okay. Are there some questions, challenges, or further thoughts you would like to raise? Bill?
This is microphone, please.
This is being recorded. Your thoughts may be used against you.
As long as they're not tweeted. I picked up just something on what Ian just said, because I was surprised not to hear more about the coexistence, recent and fragile as it has been, of representative democracy with market capitalism as they both evolved through the 19th century, and the reciprocal rent-seeking on the one hand, but also the reciprocal interdependence that can be constructive, and how that plays into both what Ira was discussing and then also these three models and Du Bois' challenge for inclusion between those who have power in the marketplace, those who have access to power in the political process, and the interchange between the two.
What's the rule, boss?
The rule is that you, and in this case Ian, may respond briefly.
the question's larger than we can encompass right now. I mentioned our late friend and colleague Chuck Tilley, who made the argument that two great macro structures, certainly of Western and now global modernity, are the modern state, the sovereign state, with which claims indivisible sovereignty over people and territory, has a distinct ensemble of institutions and a legitimating story. That's on the one side. And on the second, you have political economy, but based on the concentration of capital, investment, and market exchange. Too simple, but let's just say it. And the question you're asking is, well, what's the nature of the connection? Here, my very brief answer is in the spirit of Karl Polanyi, which is to say three things, one sentence each. First, they're indispensable one without the other. That is to say, we have learned that the resources a state needs to function and even do justice require a productive economy of a capital and market kind. Second, that world of markets and capital cannot succeed absent state rules, regulation, and third, it cannot succeed unless the members of the larger polity and society have some baseline sense of security, what Polanyi called society acting to protect itself through the political process. And two last sentences. The danger is the following, and the achievement is the following. The danger, Polanyi taught us, came in the 1920s, when we had just enough bad regulation of the marketplace to cause it to fail, but not enough regulation to create social justice. And the products of that were fascism and worse. Reciprocally, when the engagement of state and markets happens productively in the best way, aspects of the New Deal are such an example, you get the growth of productivity, legitimacy, and capacity that can underpin a decent liberal democratic order and even restricting and lowering dimensions of inequality as opposed to increasing them. So there's a wide continuum of possibilities in state-market relations, and the question is how we create a sphere of reason, perhaps democratic reason, to govern that relationship.
I don't have a lot to add to that. I agree with what was said. My view of capitalism from the point of view of democracy is sort of you can't live with it and you can't live without it. The democracy and capitalism have endogenous logics that undermine one another, but which they also create mutual dependencies. And that's the creative tension when it's creative and the destructive tension when it's destructive. And I think that social science is hugely important to trying to develop ways of coping with that tension. Yeah.
Yes, please. Yes. Wait, Sarah, yeah, mic's being passed over.
Probably a good idea in my case. I'd wonder if each of you would care to comment or toss out an idea of what you think, one single thing that comes to the top of your mind that would give us a more robust set of democracies in the 21st century.
Thanks, Ira. I think, part of what's coming out of the conversation and part of what I've come to feel strongly both as a citizen and as a scholar is that, we've been lacking a sort of profound sense of humility about democracy, and I think that recent months have, when we talk about comparative democracies and how we think about democracies in plural, there was always a kind of unspoken assumption that the US democracy was the sort of gold standard by which everything else could be measured. And I think that, it's become, if it wasn't clear before, it's become very clear that that's not true, and that I would almost, like for us to take a sort of ethnographic or other approach to our democracy that we've taken to others all around the world, and to really think about its vulnerabilities and its weaknesses and how it might be sort of renewed. Certainly the principles, the liberal principles are I think evergreen, but I think how we enact those needs to be reimagined. And so for me, a first step is to, I think, sit with that humility about the sort of failure of something we thought we had accomplished, or some thought we had accomplished.
The single thing I would want done now would be to have two, really refers to economics and markets. I would want there to be an absolute floor beneath which persons, citizens, members of a society cannot fall under any circumstances. And I would barriers to the that distort open democratic debate, argument, negotiation, and decision through the instrument of money itself. That is to restore a state of security of citizens as they participate in the democratic process, and restore a sense that the democratic process itself is genuinely open on an egalitarian basis to all who are members of the polity.
I would say, focusing on the U.S., the two most important things that are I think, realistically utopian, that could actually, we could imagine happening. One is what Ira just mentioned. It's curtailing radically the role of money in politics. This is not about Citizens United. It's really about Buckley versus Vallejo. It's about the 1976 equation of money with speech. Once you did that, it was only a matter of time before we would wind up where we are. The other is we need big, strong programmatic parties. We need parties that compete on programs. And the way to get that in the U.S. context is to get rid of things like primaries and caucuses, and to gerrymander to make districts competitive. We now have a system in which more than 90% of the congressional districts in this country are not competitive, and that the only election that therefore matters is the primary, which massively distorts the process of trying to get programmatic parties. But if I don't stop there, Ira will hit me over the head, because I'll sound like a broken record to him. He's heard me on this theme many times, so I'll stop.
I agree about the theme. I wonder, when we speak of realistic utopias, what our time frame is for the realism. When I think about better, more effective political parties in the US, I worry that it becomes very long term. But what I would put as my single argument is social cohesion, including around moral discourse, that could underpin the more political recreation of a center in American society. Please. One's coming.
I continue to be astounded by the fact that there's been a very short period of time in which we seem to have moved from not an assumption that we're a utopia, but certainly very complacent about the state of our democracy and many others, to a situation where we're kind of in a dystopian despair. So, you had this thesis and this antithesis, and I wonder if anybody would like to opine on what the synthesis, the sort of post-Trumpian era, is going to look like. because I can't imagine that we'll go back to the status quo ante.
All right. Who is Ficta in this group?
Craig should start.
Really? Why? I'm going to look like that State Department official who is called upon to explain what Trump was saying.
Well, I would just say with Yogi Berra that prediction is dangerous, particularly about the future.
And I would just say, depending on where you're looking in the U.S., that's always been the case. You know, the democracy has always been a mess for some of us. And so, you know, so I think humility, as I said before, but also, you know, a real gimlet-eyed look at the history of the demos and of democracy and how we've thought about it, and the way that our discourse too often sort of, you know, occludes the fact that it's always been deeply sort of jagged and uneven. And I think there's something to learn both from what we've ignored and also to go back and learn from, you know, what folks like Du Bois were saying about democracy in 1910, 1935, and the like.
No, Ira's going to say something about this. The
I'm-
future.
Yes, I'm reflecting one more second before I say it. It seems to me that the issue of a synthesis won't quite happen. What I think is the world we live in is a permanently widened continuum, which ranges from confidence to the absence of it. I think it's a feature of our existence that we have to navigate within that field of tension, and we won't easily, or in the near future at least, overcome it. But there are positive features to that, which is that it gives a scope for knowledge and imagination. It's what I meant in passing when I talked about moments when we can't be unself-conscious about the underpinnings and values that shape the world in which we live. So if social science can somehow, I'll stick to social science for a moment, combine a degree of self-consciousness about large, big values and questions with the more micro-focused world of social science that worries about things like causal inference and what mechanisms are shaping what in the world you inhabit in economics and elsewhere, then it seems to me if we can move up and down that ladder of the broad to the particular and focus it on distinctive large problems as well, we have a chance to do something at least as creative, or challenged to be something at least as creative as that immediate post-war generation did for us in reconstructing the Enlightenment and in reconstructing and making modern social science bond with democracy in fresh ways.
So my colleagues bought me time to think without visibly looking stupid up here while doing it. I think Ira's remarks made a wonderful concluding flourish. She wanted me to go first, so it would lead to that, but I'm going to go last, trouble it only by saying, if there is a quote, synthesis in this future, and I'm not sure that's the right way to think about it, it will have to confront the progressive narrative that you described, in which, and Alondra described, in which democracy is a story about us, and it keeps getting better, and others come towards us in that. We will have to reimagine what it means to say we, in we the people, in a context where we can't think anymore that all paths lead towards American democracy. And the rise of China can be a symbol for this. It's not the whole story of a restructured global context in which being able to say this is simply the path to the end of history is no longer a political possibility, and that will change how we think about us. Yeah, please. And then Judith, and then, yeah. We'll take 3 more questions, and then I'm just going to close it off arbitrarily. All three together. Yeah, sorry, I didn't make that clear. All three. So please, go ahead. The microphone is being passed to you.
Sorry. So if we could focus for a second, Professor Katznelson, on your notion that one of your prescriptions for democracy is a minimum safety net at the bottom of society. If I could ask you to look for a second at the other end, the top of society, what is your view on where in the world we go with just the vast inequality that exists at the top of society, and can democracy survive with that vast inequality?
Okay, hold that thought, Ira. Judith. Here, just take mine. I'm right here.
Perhaps because I'm an anthropologist, I particularly wanted to follow up on Alondra's suggestion about an ethnographic perspective. And in the particular context, for example, you mentioned Citizens United. Floyd Abrams, who defended that success or argued it successfully before the Supreme Court, takes a very celebratory approach toward American concepts of freedom of speech compared to their limitations in other countries, in Europe and in England and Australia. So the question is, as we think about what this future might be, perhaps we want to be more ethnographically inclined as well and do some comparative analysis of democracies as we see them in different areas, rather than being the gold standard or assuming we are.
So, all right, just a last question about time. And so, and time and democratic reasons. So a lot of the references actually dealt with what I would refer to as the analog period in time, where generation was 25 years. If you fast forward to today and think about social science research data, they're being developed in the digital time where generation is 18 months. And the ways in which we actually sort of put together this tension between the 25-year perspective and the 18-month perspective is also part of the tension as we think through what we mean by democratic reason going forward. I'd love your thoughts on this.
All right, folks, we have 3 questions. I'm going to give each person a chance to answer as many or as much of the 3 as they can. And I'll give Ira the last word, and I'll excuse myself. Ian.
Well, just being a card-carrying political scientist, I would just say that the conventional wisdom in political science really is that the U.S. is not and never has been the gold standard, that we designed this Rube Goldberg machine for the failed project of preventing a civil war. There are many better models of democracy out there than the U.S. model, I think that's completely uncontroversial in political science. When we talked about the possible reforms, and I said that I thought getting money out of politics and reforming the aspects of the party system, like the way in which we've gerrymandered and like things like primaries and so forth, the reason I think it's realistically utopian is that those things are not written into the Constitution. A couple of Supreme Court appointments by the next Democratic president in 3 years and 8 months or whatever it is from now would be enough to reverse Buckley. And so, whereas getting rid of presidentialism and creating a parliamentary system, that would we'd take a constitutional amendment. So I think these things are realistically utopian. We just have to fight for them.
So point taken, Ian, about other democracies. I think but when you marry the political discourse here with geopolitical power, that sort of can lead in how we think about democracy in ways that are, I think, worth appreciating. To Judith's point, I would only agree, and I think it's part of what we might do as a council, for example, would be to have scholars of politics, political scientists, and others in the social sciences from abroad help us to think about the democracy here and democracies elsewhere, right? And so that, a kind of, to use Ira's phrase, a kind of, an ethnographic sensibility or methodology with a global awareness, right? Could be an interesting way to think through this particular problem. Earl, to your point, I can only agree. I mean, I think that the acceleration of democratic illogics. I mean, when you, particularly thinking about alternative sources of news and fake news and these sorts of things are something that we have to grapple with. And I think it would be, this is part of the kind of question I was getting to at the end with regards to how do we think about failure and what's a kind of social science of the failure of democratic forms in part that are enabled by this acceleration and sort of what to do about that. So I don't have any great answers, but to only say, that I agree that something we should think about.
Ira, please give us great answers on inequality, ethnography, and acceleration. And they'll be your last
If anyone
words.
can do it, he can.
Well, just let me say, looking at who's here, I'm taking enormous pleasure from colleagues with whom I work every day at the SSRC, colleagues with whom I work in political science land at Columbia and beyond, and in history land, colleagues who have served the Social Science Research Council as faculty on advisory committees, on visiting committees, on the board, colleagues with whom I've worked and who even were my boss as Jonathan, colleagues who have responsibilities in philanthropy, Judith and Earl as two examples, the density of thoughtfulness in this room, as well as my colleagues to my right and my left, just very inspiring this evening. So I really want to thank you all for coming. That extra 2 minutes of rumination has not given me the opportunity to think through good answers. But nonetheless, let me just say, yes, that's all right, it's okay. Thanks. Yes for ethnography, that's, but ethnography itself has a deeply checkered history. So there's no automatic cosmopolitanism, universalism, egalitarianism associated with ethnography or any other kind of social science method. The method itself does not produce the answer. The method itself is an instrument to deal with the kinds of big questions that Jonathan and Earl were both asking. Inequality. I think we're in an interesting game of experiment, of learning, but we've been there before, at least a little bit in the robber baron age, of discerning how great the gap can be and still be consistent with the reproduction of a liberal democracy. To my taste, it is possible to achieve, we know it's possible to achieve, a more progressive tax regime and a nuanced, regulated political economy that can, that is not at odds with the capacity of the economy to generate productivity, jobs, profit, and so on. The question is how to do that wisely, and for that we're not going to figure that out in the next 30 seconds, but it's a zone of what might be called democratic reason that is absolutely essential. And if we're caught between the extremes of let anything free market reign on the one hand, or eliminate the capacities of quote, economic freedom, to use the Milton Friedman term, just stop it. Neither of those extremes guides us where we need to go. I'm myself something of a social democrat by preference, and I would look to the traditions of public policy regulation and the like, that in fact we have a repertoire of experiences on which to draw. We're not starting de novo. The question about time, and you could say time, in various scholarly and popular imaginations, time annihilating space, time accelerating. I think actually that's partly true, but it's not the whole story, and it comes to thinking about the world, the globe, as highly differentiated in terms of our temporalities, including our own personal temporalities. I dear family is here. It's a marriage that's lasted a half century so far. That's slow, but wonderful. And there are other temporalities I and we exist in that are quicker than the ones you spoke about. I was finally will end with a story. If Tom Asher is here, my colleague, told me about I was given a gift the other day by the American Political Science Association of a Maasai warrior cloak, which had to do with a history of workshops that Ron Casimir and I were been involved with through the American Political Science Association for African political scientists. Nothing to do with the SSRC, as it were. And I was in my office talking to Tom as when this gift was brought, and he told me about meeting a wonderful gentleman in Kenya who asked him how many wives he had. And when he said one, the man was absolutely astounded that, and wanted to know how you do that. And he said, well, it's a love match. And he said something like, that's ridiculous, or what? That's crazy. So in a world of time and in a world of space, we all inhabit and live and take as natural multiple dimensions. What's new, and my last word, and it's both obvious and banal, because I don't know what to do with it, is that I said before that we have a widened continuum of possibilities from good to terrible. We also have on another axis very different kinds of temporalities that coexist with each other. Much more dramatic heterogeneity that we've ever had. And I don't think we've yet figured out what to do with that.
I'm charged with wrapping all this up in 5 minutes or less, but really much less because I note that we're behind schedule. I'm going to suggest that some work remains for Alondra and the Social Science Research Council in the future. And I'm going to bullet point 5 things, 15 seconds each. The thing didn't get totally resolved today. One of them got put on the agenda very well by Ira, more than once in his talk, in his reference to Polanyi later in other settings, this pivotal issue of underlying structural changes that alter the reality of the world in which democracy does or doesn't thrive, and thus also the assumptions underpinning theoretical claims and practical projects of democracy, which assumptions are inflected by the world but not reducible to it, and there's a whole tension and story here. Secondly, just barely coming up, is the issue of contradictions, as distinct from differences that can be compromised. And we have, I think, only the beginnings of ideas about how to grapple well with contradictions, and we find ourselves referring back to a variety of late 18th and early 19th century thinkers, often when confronting them, but being able to deal with contradictions and then the questions of how they get resolved. I was thinking when Ian was speaking, doesn't the marketplace of ideas and the reference to political contestation throw us back to a question for how do these get resolved? Is it by direct power that democracy was going to limit in some ways, by moral commitments, which have a sort of historical arbitrariness, by science? Well, I'll add, what about learning? Because at other points, Dewey would have put, perhaps less naive moments, not just everyone's a scientist, but everyone is learning, and that there is some potential for learning in society. But how do we resolve contradictions? That can't be compromised. Third, I'd mention what I just called historical arbitrariness. Could put it in a different register and call it performative constitution, but of solidarity and moral values. The way we get to be us or to claim a society and how we come to terms with what we've inherited, what we're thrown into, what's part of who we are and what we work with in society seems to me very importantly on the agenda. Fourth, blind spots. As distinct from different views of recognized facts and issues, the existence of blind spots, of things we don't see and therefore can't readily reason about, and yet somehow we need the humility to allow for. And finally, the dramatic, maybe radical asymmetry of what we have knowledge of, including the way in which our knowledge is geographically, but also in class terms and other terms, asymmetrical. And just the sheer extent to which what we take to be knowledge, and therefore fact, is knowledge and facts about some things and not others, and therefore not as absolute as we're apt to make it out to be. So as I said, there's work remaining, and there are lots of other questions. Fortunately, in the next 5 years, most of them will be resolved under Alondra's leadership as she builds on the really distinguished heritage of her predecessor and maybe predecessors. Yeah. So thank you all for being with us for this discussion. The next task for you is to follow colleagues from the SSRC's leadership to get to Pratt House and the reception, which is upstairs. Sorry, to get upstairs in Pratt House to the reception. Saying that wrong, right? So, my instructions are wrong. I'm an ex-New Yorker. I've forgotten all things relevant, right? First, go upstairs to the reception.